everybody, welcome to yet another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this June 29th. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
And our friend Mike is not with us today. He is on vacation. I hope he's having a great time while we're plugging away, working hard. However, today we are bringing you our interview with none other than Dan Brereton. Dan is a absolute fantastic artist. If you don't know his name, you sure as hell know his style. You may recognize his work specifically from Batman, Thrillkiller, Superman and Batman, Legends of the World Finest, and JLA 7 Caskets. He's got a unique style, and he's absolutely just a joy to talk to.
Yeah, he's a big Universal horror film guy like myself. And if you look at the books he's done, the Nocturnals, his series, it's one of the coolest illustrated books. It's wonderful horror, wonderful mystery. Such a super talented guy, and talking to him was an absolute blast.
So, without further ado, let's get to the interview. This is Dan Brereton. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to start off the same way we ask everyone. How did you discover comic books?
That's like one of my favorite things to talk about, actually. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because
Cool.
I seem to not be able to not talk about it at any opportunity. But when I was we're talking 1974. So I was 8 years old. I had a friend in grade school. I grew up in a suburb outside of San Francisco called San Ramon. Brand new neighborhood, new school, out in the middle of the, like the countryside where they just started plopping homes in the early 70s. And I had a friend there who was from back east, this kid Eric. And he and his older brothers collected comics. And so that's how I was introduced to comic books, was coming to this kid's house and seeing the stuff he had. And to be honest, up until that time, when I thought of comic books, I had seen like Harvey books like Richie Rich and Casper the Ghost, but I never really paid that much attention to them, which is interesting because I love to draw. I loved children's books, cartoons, but for some reason, comics weren't on the radar. It might have been because my parents were raised to believe that comic books were a bad influence on kids. And that's because of the bad rap that a lot of comics got in the mainstream in the 50s. Even though my parents liked Western comics and things like that. My mom was a big fan of like Roy Rogers and stuff. Anyway, so Eric shows me his comic book collection, and he's got, Avengers, Captain America, Thor, mostly Marvel stuff. And I think the first comic I ever laid eyes on was a Captain America comic that was from the 60s that Jack Kirby had drawn. So it was a back issue. It wasn't a new book at the time. And I just gravitated toward that. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. Because I already loved art. I loved stories. I was a kid that went to the library early on, loved to read. And this stuff just hit me like a ton of bricks. And Kirby's stuff was so amazing. And then he starts showing me, well, this is John Buscema, and this is Neil Adams, and this guy's Gene Colan, and here's even a new of Steranko. And he's 8 years old because his older brother, who is practically an adult, he was probably 19, lived at home still. He had long boxes full of books, and I'd never seen a long box before in my life. I didn't, let alone a comic that was in a bag. And this is how I was introduced to this world. And so the first time I remember talking my parents into letting me go into a 7-Eleven convenience store and giving me like $1, I bought 4 comics. And I think one was Thor, 2 of them were Conan. I'm not sure what the other one was. So I gravitated to John Buscema's work like right away. And I just got sucked in so completely into the world of Marvel and all the books they were publishing so quickly. And that was this like whirlwind summer for me, where it really just consumed me, and it was everything. It just became everything. It became my whole world.
Now, do you still have some of the first issues that you started collecting?
I don't have any of the actual copies that I had as a kid, because my first collection, which was probably in the 300 range of number of comics, by the time, like, this is probably a year later, a year or two later, got lost and destroyed. And that was very crushing. And then I started over like right away. Eric gave me like 7 books and said, here, start over. And so I started over again. And I think that was around the time that Giant Size X-Men #1 was coming up. So that was 75. And but up until that time, I was just, like I said, consumed with comics. And so we went on a trip. I remember we went on a trip to Canada in the summer of 75. So this is the whole year of having collected comics. And I remember I was really bummed out because I'd seen this book advertised in the pages of Marvel called Deathlock, the Demolisher, which was Amazing Adventures 25 or 26. And I was like, wow, that looks so crazy good. That looks so good. And I was a big fan of like Killraven and War of the Worlds by that time, and stuff that my parents were just like shaking their heads at, like, why do you like this stuff? It's so violent. And I said, because he rides a serpent stallion, And so we were camping, and we went to this little general store in the middle of nowhere, and I'm walking around, and I noticed they have some magazines, and there were just a smattering of comics on the bottom of a shelf, and there was Deathlock staring at me. And that just felt like a sign. Those kinds of things felt like a sign to me. It was just like the happiest moment of the summer practically. And then after that, every time we would go into a new town on our way to Calgary, because we were visiting family over in Canada, we drove there from California. I would look for comics. I got to the point where I would look at them in places where you wouldn't find comics, because I was just in a hope I might see one, because I was just completely nuts about it. And of course I wanted to draw comics, but of course I didn't think I'd ever be good enough, because you're looking at this stuff and you're mesmerized by it. You're enthralled by it. You have no idea how John Buscema draws a person, let alone a hand. And so my interest in drawing got into cartooning. I started getting into like Walt Kelly and Charles Schultz and Jim Davis and just comic strips in general, because that felt like something I could do. And I started getting into cartooning, and I got pretty good at it. And then I got into high school and discovered like Bernie Wrightson and Frank Frazetta, and it was all over after that, and I got a little more confident in my abilities, and just worked at it.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to ask you about your style, because you have a fantastic style, and it certainly lends itself to the work that you have done and the characters that you've worked on over the years. How did you, the style that you work in, I guess I should say, is that something it just came to you naturally, as maybe some people do, or is that something that you refined over time or kind of worked at it?
I had for people who don't know, who are going to Google the stuff, you'll see a lot of color stuff, a lot of painted work and things like that. And in the 90s, I was referred to most of the time as a painter, which we were talking earlier. And I said, I'm not really crazy about that moniker.
We won't call you a painter. Don't worry.
It's fine. I'm so used to it. But like I said, I prefer to think of myself as an illustrator and aspire to that. But someone who loves storytelling, because story is everything to me. I think I came to that realization 10 or 15 years ago that really was about telling stories. And because I spent so much time, even as a kid, creating characters and worlds and coming up with ideas and wanting to see them have adventures. And so I was drawn to drawing. And then I was drawn to, again, seeing Frazetta's work, the idea of doing things in color and painting. And I was taking art classes in high school and dabbled a little bit with that. But I didn't have the kind of confidence in my draftsmanship in high school that I would have needed to. So I was still thinking in kind of terms of doing things that were funny or silly. I remember picking up copies of Not Brand Ek when I was, in high school and kind of rediscovering those comics again and thinking, wow, I love this parody stuff. It's fun. And it's not super realistic. And maybe so I started doing that stuff for a while, kind of parody, funny superhero stuff. And then by the time I was further on in high school, about a senior, I discovered in the pages of sort of, Savage Sword of Conan, an ad for a comic called Cerebus the Aardvark, which was this cartoon aardvark who was kind of at the time, in the beginning, he was a satirical version of like a barbarian character like Conan if he was an aardvark. And I fell in love with that idea, and I got really into that. And so for a while I wanted to be like Dave Sim, and this is around the time I was getting out of high school in 1983. I wanted to be like Dave Sim, and I, although I was loving like all the stuff that was coming out at the time, I loved Nexus, I loved Walter's run on Thor was amazing. It helped get me back into reading mainstream comics again and going back to 7-Eleven. And like, I didn't even know at that point, like when new comics came, and I figured, they come on Wednesday or Tuesday night. I'd go into 7-Eleven at like midnight or something, and there'd be all these new books. And, there's a new episode, there's a new issue of Thor or whatever was coming out. And so that was a rebirth for me. And then I thought, okay, well, I want to do my own comics. And I investigated printing and self-publishing. I talked to people like Diana Schutz, and I talked to Denny Sim, who was publishing Dave Sim's work at the time. I wrote letters to Bud Plant. Bud Plant wrote me back. I was really, really serious about self-publishing, or trying to find someone to publish this kind of sword and sorcery fantasy comic that I had drawn 2 issues of called Storm Knight. And I was going to call my company Dark Horse Comics. Yeah. Then I found out, Dark Horse Comics, I guess, already exists, but that took me a while before I figured that out. So what happened was I based on just a lot of soul searching at the time, as much as you can do when you're young and stupid, I thought maybe I should go to art school. Maybe I should try real art school, and get better before I really tackle this. And so that's what I did. I put the comic book stuff aside for a while, and I got deep into, I went to the went to California College of Arts and Crafts not San Francisco, Oakland, California, which is across the bridge from San Francisco. I went there for 2.5 years, and I learned drawing, painting, life drawing, design, stuff that has been so invaluable and has meant all the difference in the world. And that's where I met 2 comic book artists who had gone to that school, Steve Purcell and Mike Mignola. They came walking into one of my classes one day, and the teacher said, hey, come on over here. And we were doing a crit that day. So we had been working on some stuff, and all of our stuff was on the board for people to see. And Mike later told someone that my stuff was the only stuff that when you got close up, it still looked good. And if you've ever been in an art class where people put stuff on the wall, you'd know exactly what he's talking about, because you'll look at everything and go, oh, that's good. And then you get close up and you see it doesn't quite gel upon close inspection. Maybe the line work or the drawing isn't quite there. And it was very complimentary. And my teacher said, hey, you should take this kid under your wing. And so I went over to they lived nearby in an apartment complex that Arthur Adams had lived in just like up to like a month before. And at the time, these 3 guys were like there was Steve Moncouse, who did Fish Police and was a friend of theirs, used to call them the Unimind, because they all acted the same. They all talked the same. They had the same inflections when they spoke. And I so wanted to be part of their club, and it was never going to happen. But I did get to hang out with them a few times, and I got a lot of good advice and feedback, and a little harassing. But, in the end, it was all good for me, because I ended up getting work a few months later at a convention with Eclipse Comics, doing a little backup thing with this unknown writer named Kurt Busiak on a magazine called Merchants of Death. And we did a backup called Ransom in this. Basically what it was 4 or 6 issues of reprints of Breccia's soldier and mercenary comics, reprints in English. And we did a backup for that. And that was the first very forgettable job that I did as a penciler. And my career was about to come to a grinding halt from the very get-go. I left my first visit to San Diego, the first time I ever got on a plane and flew to San Diego, flew anywhere for that matter. I went home a day early because I was just so depressed. And I'll tell you what happened is I was there on a Friday, and I'm looking at the work of these young painter guys. Again, they were painters. Okay. I said, illustrator. Dave McKean, Kent Williams, John J. Muth, and George Pratt were all in this one row in Artist Alley. And this is back when San Diego was 3 big rooms, and that was it. And I looked at the stuff they were doing, and they're working really large, and they were doing everything all in one page. I'd never done a painted page before, never painted a comic book page before. And I just marveled at this stuff. And I remember asking Kent Williams, I said, what happens if you screw up a panel? You know, I mean, this stuff is all done on one sheet. What do you do? He goes, you just got to work on it until you fix it. I go, well, what if you can't fix it? This is how like insecure I was. What if you can't fix it? He said, well, you just have to live with it. And I was just like, wow, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I could just live with something that I knew wasn't good enough. And I got so depressed that day. I went home a day early. I didn't even tell my friends my fellow art students that had gone with me. I didn't tell them I was going home. I just said, I'll see you later. And then I got a flight home, and I just got to the airport. And I came home. My parents were like, what's going on? Because I was home. This was in the middle of art school. It was like this before my last year of school. So it was the summertime, and I was living in the Sierra Nevada, my parents' house for the summer. And I said, I just didn't feel like I belonged there. Eclipse had been, quote, mildly unimpressed with the work I'd done on Ransom. I just felt like I didn't know what to do with myself. So I went home, and then I really reapplied myself the next semester at art school. And one of my teachers, who was a famous movie poster artist named Kazuhiko Sano, he painted the Return of the Jedi movie posters, among many, many other things. He gave us this weekends assignment, a personal illustration project that we came up with that we worked on the weekends. And at the end of the semester, we would turn it in. There were no limitations on what we could do. So I thought, I think what I'll do is I'll do a painted comic book story. And the 7 pages that I produced in that semester became the first 7 pages of The Black Terror, which came out a year later from Eclipse Comics. When I showed that stuff around during Christmas break, I got hired immediately by Eclipse to do The Black Terror, which was a reboot of the Golden Age character that was written by Bo Smith and Chuck Dixon. And that was my big break in comics. And that led to A Psycho and Legends of the World's Finest and Thrillkiller, 10 years of working with DC Comics and doing a lot of other things. And I really don't know what that was, other than just the drive to just really want it so badly that I couldn't consider anything else. I knew it was what I wanted to do, and I had a feeling that I was meant to do it, not like it was fate, but like, what else was I going to do? This was what I felt like I was good at. And I was lucky in that time period because they were hiring painters. If you could, Mike Mignola once said, if you can hold a brush, they'll hire you as a painter. And I said, hey, thanks a lot. I don't know if he meant me, but I knew what he meant, though, because there was this one Marvel graphic novel I had to turn down because I was doing something else. I think a Clive Barker graphic novel, and they hired some other person to do it. And every time I see that, like in a dollar bin somewhere, I look at that and go, I could have done this book. Captain America, Iron Man sort of graphic novel. And I was like, God, it could have been me. I would have walloped this one, And to this day, I've never really done a Marvel superhero graphic novel. I mean, I came close a few times, but then there was a spate of firings that was going on in the late 90s. And 2 different editors offered me these great jobs. And then they got fired like the next week. And so I have done stuff for Marvel. I have done, full length issues and stories and things like that, but never like a whole big, like painted mini series, like I would have loved to have done, like the kinds of things I did for DC and love doing for DC. So I know there was an answer to a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, I'm just wondering, when you were at Eclipse, what was the biggest takeaway you got from being there about the comic industry in general?
In the very beginning, like I said, I turned in a job, I turned in work, and I had an editor there named Fred Burke, who was very young, exuberant, honest. He was a good editor, and he was in my corner. And he's the one that brought my work over to Kat Ironwood and Dean Mulaney, the husband and wife team that ran. She was the editor and he was the publisher that ran Eclipse. And they didn't want to know me. They had no interest in me. And then he showed them the stuff I was doing that I'd done in class or at home, not in class, but for the class. And they perked up, and it changed. They had me come out there, and they liked what I was doing. They kind of they understood that the first job I'd done for them was I was at sea, and it wasn't really just penciling and not being able to finish the work was a brand new thing. I'd done penciling samples, but that is a whole aesthetic that you really have to learn and hone, that skill of being a penciler. And, I did get better at it, but most of the time I had opportunity just to finish it myself. So I was very lucky in that way. But I learned a lot, and they, I think because they were a smaller company, there was more leeway. There wasn't quite as much pressure. It didn't pay as well, but for me, it paid just fine because prior to that, I was working whatever job I could get. I worked in a movie theater. It was the last real job I had. But I credit them with teaching me a lot and being patient with me and kind of nurturing me. And when I won the Russ Manning Promising Newcomer Award for the Black Terror in 1990, they were very proud and they showed it. They didn't tell me I was nominated when they gave me a ticket to the dinner. That might have been helpful. I might not have been an hour late. I walk in there and dinner's already done. My editor runs up and goes, "Some things you can't be late for." I go, "What's the big deal? What do you care if I'm here or not?" He goes, "You're nominated." I go, "What?" And 5 minutes later, they're reading the nominees' names. And then another minute later, Dave Stevens is handing me this plaque for an award I never heard of. I'm 24 or something at the time, maybe 23, 24. And he says to me, I'd never met Dave Stevens. He says to me, "I voted for you." And that was oh my gosh, that was so huge. And it wasn't like I felt like I was some kind of superstar. I just felt like I was accepted and people got it, which was great. And then by that time, I was already working on the Psycho for DC, which was a creator-owned book that I did with James Hudnall, which was another great concept. But I went back and worked with Eclipse on Dread, which was a Clive Barker graphic novel that Fred and I adapted. He wrote the script and I did the art, and that was an interesting job. And then they slowly went out of business after that, which was sad. And I missed that they're around. I missed the time that they were around. They were a very vital, vibrant, colorful, and energetic part of comics at the time. In the 80s, they were huge for that.
You mentioned it, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about working on Dread. Because I'm a fan of Clive Barker. I've read a whole bunch of other, Hellraiser related comics that have come out over the years. I heard of Dread, but I'm going to be honest, I have not actually read it, but I have seen your art for it. Only because the story scared the shit out of me a bit. So, what was that experience like? Did you get to work with him?
No, but I did get to meet him. So Fred Burke, again, Fred, my editor, was a big fan of Clive's, and he was a friend of Clive's. And when Eclipse had the license to do Clive's stuff, Fred was the point man on that, and he was perfect for the job. He also had a huge crush on Clive. Told me all kinds of stuff about Clive. Some of it was a little hair raising, but mostly, he seemed like a great guy. And I love the fact that Clive didn't get popular and famous until he was in his 30s. I always felt like that was a kind of inspirational story. And I had been reading horror, and I was into horror and stuff, and I was reading his stuff for a while. And then I jumped from Clive Barker to crime fiction. James Ellroy, actually, which was the novel Black Dahlia by James Ellroy is as close to a horror novel as you're going to get in a crime fiction book. So it was a good transition book for me. And that's when I started getting into crime fiction out of horror. But although I love all that stuff, I love all the genres now. I read everything. But so I was reading books of blood, and Dread stood out to me. This is before they'd asked me to do anything. This is a couple, 2-3 years before. So I was reading Clive Barker, and Dread, the short story, had always stuck out to me because it was a psychological one. It wasn't supernatural. Not that I don't love supernatural stuff, but there was something about it that just really gets you. It's the deviousness of the main character's plot and what he does to his best friends, supposedly. And it just really hit home with me. And so later, when they were telling me they were going to do these Clive Barker things, and they asked me if I was interested, I'm pretty sure I said Dread, and they said, yeah, we haven't assigned that yet, and you'd be perfect for that. And so I did that, and I when the book came out at San Diego that year, Clive Barker and I did a signing together, so I got to sit and we got to talk. And such a charming, handsome, talented guy. I mean, he's so charismatic. You could totally see right away, you know, he's just this, he's one of those guys who's got that light around him, you know, and he's just a cool guy. And I thought, wow, I know Clive Barker now. I don't know Clive Barker. We spent an hour, but he made you feel that way. That's what kind of person he was. He made you feel like you were friends, you know? And if we met again, I'm sure he'd be just as friendly. It's just the kind of person he is. And then I got completely out of Clive Barker's stuff. I was like into it, and then I was out of it. So by the time I was finished with Dread, I wasn't reading any more Clive Barker. I was moving on, which is kind of what I do. I just sort of digest things, digest them, and then I move on to something else that catches my fancy. You know, whatever that might be. At the time, I think I was, like I said, I was reading like James Ellroy and all the Black Lizard crime fiction stuff and getting into that, which helped inform later the Nocturnals, because I was trying to do crime fiction mixed with horror and Halloween and, you know, all the things I loved. I was mashing them up into the Nocturnal. But yeah, I would say try and find that book. Dread has been out of print for a really long time. I'm not sure. There were some crazy things that happened with Eclipse as far as the films and properties and things like that after the company disbanded. And there are stories about how this stuff's sitting in a warehouse somewhere. Or I know Todd McFarlane owns the rights to the Black Terror, and for some reason has not let us put that book out again. It's really
they'd made a movie years ago when they were doing like the they had a run like every year of these like 8 horror nights or 7 or 30. I don't know. They had like
talking about, there was a Books of Blood was one of the movies, and then there was one called Red. And I'm pretty sure I've seen it. It's just kind of weird to look at it because I don't know how faithful it is to his story, but we were very faithful. Fred was very faithful in adapting Dread almost to a fault. And I only say that because it was such a close adaptation that sometimes I felt like we could have relaxed that a little bit, because when you're adapting something, you're not necessarily trying to copy it. But we did a very, very faithful adaptation. And so when I saw that other version of it, I didn't quite recognize it. That makes any sense. Like my main character was not like some Adonis looking, you know, Dorian Gray type, like in the movie, as I remember.
That was actually, so side story. My wife actually, you know, picked that because of the guy happened to be from Twilight originally. And that's where she knew him from. So I was like, oh, okay, well, it's a horror movie, so that's cool. Yeah. And I got into it. I started watching it. I'm like, I don't really care for it too much. But I do remember reading that it wasn't, you know, like beyond maybe like the characters and the name of the movie, like it wasn't very much. It didn't really stick close to the original story very much at all.
Not very Clive Barker-y, no.
Yeah, but no.
I invite anyone to track down Dread. There are 2 versions. There's the version Eclipse published, which is a 64-page graphic novel. It has a blue cover with peach title. I don't know what that's about. It looks horrible. I did a full-on painting, and they took my full painting and they put it as a square in the center. It looks awful. I was so depressed when I saw that cover. I thought, what did you do? But then a year later, HarperCollins came out with these editions where they took 2 stories and put them together in one book. So Dread came out with the cover it was supposed to have, an embossed foil titles. It looks so perfect. And it has another story, backup story in it, which I think it's called Life of Death, but I can't remember exactly. All I know is that Howard Chaykin was the model for one of the characters. So he's in that story. You just see if you know Howard Chaykin's face, you see his face in the story. But Dread is in the HarperCollins edition, and you can just tell because it's my cover, not cropped. It's the full cover on the. Okay. And you can try and find that and track it down, because it's an interesting read. It's a fascinating read, and I really feel like it's one of the more mature things I've done, in that it doesn't have a bunch of monsters. There's monsters in the imagery, but it's very much about people, and the horror is psychological, and it's reflected in the way it's illustrated. But it's not a fantasy story. You know what I mean? It's cold, calculated horror, and on its way to being more like crime fiction and the stuff I was getting into when I was doing it. So I recommend, if you're curious, you should definitely look for it. Definitely. Whenever I find copies that are affordable copies, like wherever that might be, I buy them and then I take them to shows, and if someone's interested, I say, well, I got a couple of copies of Dread, Cool. So yeah, that was I'll tell you interesting. I don't know if it's interesting, but I'll tell you a little quick side story. I was about to start Dread for Eclipse, and Marvel editor calls me and offers me a Punisher Wolverine graphic novel, which the working title was License to Print Money, because the editor said that the license to print money, it's going to make so much money. And I said, I just signed this contract with Eclipse. I can't do the book. I got to do this Clive Barker book. And I was such an idiot, because all I had to do was, I didn't know this at the time, but all I had to do was call up Eclipse and say, listen, Kat, they just offered me to do this Marvel Punisher Wolverine book. It's going to be huge. It's going to make money. It's going to sell. That will help sell more copies of Dread. And I imagine that they would have said, you're right. Why don't you do that first? But I didn't do that because I was trying to be a professional, and I was trying to be true to, I signed a contract. I'm going to do the work. And I did. And I never did my Punisher Wolverine graphic novel, which would still be fun. But yeah, license to print money.
Who got the job? Do you know?
To be honest, I don't know if they ever did it. And I was offered that job twice, and both times I was contracted to do another job, because the first time I was offered was when I was working on the Psycho for DC. Mm-hmm. And I got offered that job twice. Had to turn it down twice. That hurt.
Yeah.
It really, really hurt, man. But what can I say? I had work. So, and then I ended up doing Legends of the World's Finest, which came out, I think, in 92 or 92, 93, mm-hmm. with Walter Simonson. And that was Mike Carlin saying, what do you want to do? And at the time, Carlin was the Superman editor, and my answer was Batman. I want to do Batman. He said, well, if you're going to do Batman with me, Superman has to be in it. So why don't we do some kind of a World's Finest thing? I said, okay. I wasn't a huge Superman fan. I was a big fan of the TV show, the 50s TV show, but I wasn't like a big Superman fan. But I thought, that's fine. It'll be fun. And he says, who do you want to work with as a writer? And I said, I don't know. How about Walt Simonson? And he goes, okay, let's ask him. Now, I'll tell you, I wasn't completely in the dark about Walter, because I'd met him earlier in Scotland at a convention. I met Walter and Wheezy at this convention, and the first thing Walter said to me after we shook hands and we were introduced around, he said, I want to break your hand.
What the hell?
I said, what do you want to do? He said, it's a compliment. I want to break your hand because you're too good. I go, oh, geez. Okay, thank you. Wow. So that was a real compliment to hear from him. And they're so sweet. They're both so sweet. I used to, so Walter said yes to doing this Legends World Finest thing with me. And then we cooked up this story, and I had some ideas for things, and he had ideas, and we threw them together. And he made this really cool story where Batman and Superman's nightmares are swapped by an ancient Celtic sorcerer. And so Batman starts having dreams of like the destruction of Krypton, and Superman's having dreams of his parents being murdered, in the alleyway, and it changes their natures. And Batman becomes less kind of on his game because he's not hard and focused like he would normally be. And Superman is becoming angrier and harder. And it's because of this sorcerer is messing with them. And I said, can we put the Silver Banshee in it? He goes, yeah, let's put the Silver Banshee in there. We put the Silver Banshee in there, put Man-Bat in there, it was so fun. There's a great scene with the Joker where the Joker is visited by Superman. And at one point, the Joker thinks, well, Superman's not going to hurt me. And then Superman picks him up, and like his eyes start turning red, like he's going to smoke him. Mm-hmm. And it was so fun to do. It was so fun to do that. The scenes where Batman or Superman or whatever, scenes where people interview the Joker are always fun to do. And I've done them twice. The last time I did it was in a Batman Legends of the World's Finest story that I wrote and illustrated for DC that came out in 2015, which was it's only available digitally on the digital platform. but it's Legends of the World's Finest, or no, it's, Legends of the Dark Knight number 85 through 88, and the story's called Six Fingers. That's another one you should check out. It was supposed to get published, on a floppy, but it never did, unfortunately. And it's sad because it's I think it's one of the better things I ever did. Especially, I mean, it's like my last Batman story, and I got to do exactly what I wanted to do, and they liked it, and I couldn't have been happier with it, and they seemed to be pretty happy with it. But just the way things shook out, it never got printed, which is a real shame. But
so two things I wanted to jump in. One, the story that you were describing is the Superman Batman where they switch roles. Is how I discovered your artwork, because I'm a huge Superman fan, and I remember that distinctly because I was like, wow, this artwork badass. And then like Banshee, there was something about Banshee's style that I thought really lent itself well to your style of art, or I should say your style of art really, complemented her, her look. And I always thought like, wow, this is unique. You don't see this often. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't know. So, collecting comics over the years, I never really knew many artists' names. And, certain ones I do. And yours, I did for that reason, because your artwork was so unique to me. And I just thought it was just so badass.
Thank you.
The other thing I wanted to mention to you is that the Clive Barker Dread issue that you were describing is on Amazon. Yeah. So if anyone wants to pick it up, check it out.
Wait, saying you can buy the comic, it's not digital.
You can buy you can buy the comic, and it's the version that you described.
It says Clive Barker at the top really big, and you can see the entire artwork. And it's not cropped in on a little square. Yeah, that's the one to get. It's actually better printing too. That's really cool. I'm
Amazon, throw us some cheddar cheese, man. Come on.
Let me ask you a question. When you read Legends of the World's Finest, did you feel like it strayed too far away from the feel of a DC comic? Because I was so young at the time, and I was trying so hard to live up to what had come before, especially with Superman, because I felt there was so much. I felt I put pressure on myself to try and really deliver with Superman, because Batman, I felt like I understood, and you could get away with a lot of different things with Batman because he's been portrayed differently over the years and stuff. And at the time we had Legends of the Dark Knight had come out, and you could see Batman in this sort of more stripped down, somber version of his costume. But Superman, I mean, I was looking at all this stuff that had come before, and I felt a lot of pressure. And I think it's because I just wanted to live up to it. I kind of fell in love with Superman. So I always wondered if my Superman was, I don't know.
No, I thought it did, and I'll tell you why. Because, well, one, as a Superman fan, I think one of the things that's really endearing about Superman is also one of the things that is probably it's one of the most annoying traits about Superman is that, look, Superman's been around forever. He's the first superhero. Batman, just as long. So you can only do so much with them. So when you have moments where, things like that are flipped, it's refreshing. Mm-hmm. And you are applying the core values and traits of one character, and you're applying them to another. And this is what happens to this character if that happens. So basically, you're flipping, the outer persona of that character, but the inside is remaining. So, this is what's going to happen if Superman were in that similar situation,
because because he is Superman. He hasn't been brainwashed or taken over. He's Superman, but he's Superman with a couple of switches flipped on the Batman board. And same thing with Batman. And that was, I think, what was so fascinating about the story. There's even a scene where some hood gets the jump on Batman, which almost never happens because Batman was off his game, and Superman saves his life. And that felt like such a cool thing to do, and I just really enjoyed doing that story. And and just the fact that gave me so much leeway. And Walter would say, I like to write to an artist's strengths, which, oh my gosh, that's such a refreshing thing. It's like, it's such a gift.
Yeah, I
It
think
was such a gift to work with him.
that's the type of story that I think will really resonate well now, because in recent years you see more and more Superman stories where they portray him as a jerk. They like to make
Mm-hmm.
Superman bad now, which
Yeah.
is fine because it's a little refreshing, and he's always a good guy, and he's the big
Yeah.
blue
As long
Boy
as I don't have to
Scout.
draw the stories, I don't mind.
So like,
Because I like Superman being Superman. I have love and respect for his character because he's the first.
yeah.
He's pure in that way.
So
But
what was well, I think you kind of described it, but you've worked at Eclipse, you've worked elsewhere, obviously, but as it pertains to DC, was that how was that experience for you overall?
um, I I'm very grateful for the time and the opportunity to work with DC and to have done create our own books for DC and license stuff and to work with people like Mike Carlin, who was very gracious and patient with me as kind of a young freelancer. He was so funny. I remember he used to call me. I was a night owl, and I still am to a certain degree, but I used to work overnights. So I was always working at night when it was quiet and my friends weren't bothering me and stuff. And he would call me. He'd call from New York, and it would be like noon at my house, and I'd be sleeping. And he'd call, and I'd answer the phone, and I'd go, "Hello," and he'd go, "Did I wake you up?" And I'd be like, "Damn it." I was trying so hard to answer the phone like I was just bopping around, and I'd been, not like I was dead asleep. And he always knew, but he never, he didn't give me a hard time about it because I turned the work in. It was a punishing schedule in some ways because you were turning in 12 painted pages a month, which at the time I didn't feel like that was a punishing schedule. But now I look back and go, holy smokes, how did I do that? But I did that for 10 years at least. And what was so great about comics in the 90s was if you could come up with an idea, chances are you could do it. You could find someone who would say, yes, we will pay you to do that. And like when I came up with Giant Killer later in the 90s, this idea of like giant monsters invading basically my old hometown area in the Bay Area, and then this kind of daikaiju human hybrid warrior, which no one knew what daikaiju was in the 90s over here. Very few people knew the word kaiju. And I was just into Godzilla movies with my son, who was 2 years old at the time. We were watching these Godzilla movies on these dub tapes, these fan tapes, and unsubtitled laser discs. And I got this idea for a thing, and I pitched it to Archie Goodwin. And at the time, I'd been working with Archie on Legends of Thrillkiller, not Legends, but Thrillkiller, which is a Elseworlds idea. And that's in print. So people who are listening, you can go find that. You can get the trade paperback now. These other things we've been talking about are long out of print. But you can find Legends of the World's Finest if you look for it. It's not hard. There's 3 issues, or there's a trade paperback. And Thrillkiller was the next thing where I had this idea that I pitched to Archie, and the idea was Batgirl and Robin are boyfriend and girlfriend, but they're also the crime-fighting duo, and it's the early 60s, and they're in love, and Robin's parents get killed because they're in the circus, and Commissioner Gordon puts his best detective on the job, Detective Bruce Wayne, Gotham PD. And I pitched this idea to Archie, and I pitched it with the further notion that Howard Chaykin should be the writer, because it just seemed like something Howard would be good with. And Howard was around in 61. I wasn't quite there yet. I came along in 65. Actually, it wasn't my idea to do it in 61, but that was Howard's idea to put it further back into the 60s, early 60s. And so we were off and running on that. And that was such a wild, fun thing to do. It got harder doing the second one because Archie was getting sicker and sicker. And so I actually was working with his assistant, Chuck Kim, most of the time. But Archie was so great to work with. And he was just a sweetheart and so smart, whip funny. Just knew comics inside and out, gave you all kinds of leeway, trusted you, and Howard was Howard. You know what I mean? It wasn't always easy to work with him, but I felt lucky. Again, I felt lucky I was working with Howard, just how I felt lucky working with Walter. And that was again this thing where I pitch an idea and they say okay. And boy, oh boy, that was just the greatest thing about comics in the 90s was being able to just facilitate these ideas and stories, and to have them facilitate them for you by saying, yes, we'll pay you to do it. And so that gave me so much self-confidence and this drive to do more, to create more, and validated that the act of creating something, coming up with a concept and pitching it, and then they make it, and you feel like it energizes you, that you want to just do that for the rest of your life. You think, wow, anything I can come up with, any idea it's a decent, good idea, solid, good idea, I can do it. And it felt like I could do this for the rest of my life, you know? And it got harder and harder and harder as the comics market shrunk more and more and more. And then the novelty of an artist who did painted work had also kind of started to fade out, because they were paying us more, but the turnaround wasn't fast. So when you're paying an artist who's doing pencil, in other words, when you're doing this stuff, you're vouchering for pencils, inks, and colors rather than a painted page rate. And so they have to wait 3 times as long for it to be finished. And so they put all this money out, and then it takes longer for the return to come back. And so it gets a little bit tougher. And then you have Alex Ross coming. Alex Ross actually was around about as long as me, but he was doing some other stuff for Marvel when I was working for DC. But when he did Kingdom Come, he just dominated painted comic scene, and he dominated what people thought of as painted comics, you know, very hyper realistic. And I was still doing my more expressionistic sort of thing. And Alex and I are friends, and I've told Alex, I've said, it's like you are conforming your imagination to reality, and I'm trying to conform reality to my imagination. And I think that's how I kind of see the contrast of our styles. But it got harder and harder to really kind of set these things up. And the last thing I remember doing for DC in that era was in 2000, which was called JLA 7 Caskets, which was a Justice League one shot that I wrote. And the editor was Dan Raspler, who was very, very hard on me. He liked my work. I think he liked me. He liked to take the piss a lot with me, but he was good to work with in the way that a drill sergeant is good to work with, who is constantly trying to tear you down and then build you back up again. But that was my last big job for DC for a really long time, until I got called on to pitch a Legends of the Dark Knight story in 2013 or 2014, which I did do. And it's funny because at that time, so much time had gone by. I mean, 10 years had gone by and I hadn't been asked to do anything for DC. And I figured, well, I guess that's it. I won't be working for DC ever again. And then I got called on to do this one last Batman gig. So that was kind of cool. So anyway.
Well, I mean, you're talking about the names you worked with, but when you were with Bravura, you were working with some huge names there too. I mean, you had Peter David, Norm Brayfogle, Chaykin, as you mentioned, Jim Starlin, Marv Wolfman, Steve Grant, Walt Simonson. How did you get involved with that crew?
Not because I necessarily, had earned it, or I think, well, at the time it felt weird to be in their company because they're giants, you know what I mean? And I still felt like a kid, new kid on the block in a lot of ways. And what happened is Dark Horse had come out with Legend, which was their create-our-own thing after Image. So Image comes out with their whole lineup and very successful. And so Dark Horse says, okay, well, we have our guys. We're going to do Mignola. We're going to do Frank Miller and John Byrne, and great list of creators. And they come out with Legend. So Malibu Comics was the distributor for the first year or so of the Image stuff. And they made a ton of money distributing that first Image stuff. And so they decided to invest in a new line of books, which were like their universe. And they hired a bunch of artists to come up with stuff like Firearm and Freaks and Solitaire. And, you guys are familiar with Ultraverse, Prime. And then my entertainment lawyer, Harris Miller, who I met because he represented Walter Simonson, and he represented his contract negotiation on Legends of the World's Finest, and then also mine. That was my foray into having an entertainment attorney and contracts and stuff that you could actually negotiate. And so he set up this thing with he was helping out with some of the clients that he represented for the Ultraverse stuff that Malibu was doing. And then they got into talks about doing a creator-owned line. And at the time, it didn't have a name. And they had Howard Chaykin and Walt Simonson, as you said, and Gil Kane and Stephen Grant and Sean McManus and Norm Brayfogle, who came in a little later. I mean, what a lineup of talent. And these guys were all repped by Harris, and Harris repped me. And at the time, I wanted to do this thing called Nocturnals, okay? And I didn't know anything about any Malibu creator-owned thing. I just wanted to do Nocturnals. I finished with Legends of the World's Finest. I came up with this idea for like a horror, crime, spooky book I wanted to do. These characters had been persisting for a long time. I finally came up with a name I liked, Nocturnals. And I remember I went to WonderCon in '93, I think. And I was showing these ideas around. I showed them to the editor, this guy, Dave Olbrich at Malibu, who kind of like laughed at it. Not laughed at it like he was looking down on it, but like, wow, that's kind of cool, that's kind of cool. But he didn't say it was cool. He just laughed. But and then that same show, Mignola is showing off his Hellboy stuff that he's just set up at Dark Horse. And so Hellboy predated Nocturnals by months, just mere months, in the same year that they both came out in '94. But the miniseries anyway. So I had been talking with Bob Schreck at Dark Horse about doing something, and I said, I got this thing I want to do called Nocturnals, and I showed it to him, and then he goes, oh, this is really cool, and then let's do it. And then Harris is negotiating with Mike Richardson, and they come back with an offer, and I'm like, okay. And Harris goes, but I'm doing this other thing with these other guys. You might want to consider this. And I said, oh, what's that? And so he explains to me what would become Bravura. And I just want to say that the offer from Malibu was so sky high in the clouds compared to what I had been making that I could not turn it down. It would have been stupid. And it's okay that I didn't go with Dark Horse, although sometimes I do regret that. But I was able to do exactly what I wanted to do. The first issue of Nocturnals #1 is 32 pages of story, guys. I mean, they let me do that. That's crazy. Okay, but they let me do it. I think issue #2 is 31 pages or something like that. I just went for it. It was like the most amazing thing I was ever allowed to do in comics for myself, And so I remember when we were all kind of doing publicity for this creator-owned line, we didn't have a name yet, and it was being announced at a Philadelphia convention in 1993. And so we did this big panel with Starlin and Kane and Chaykin and Simonson and Grant and Wolfman. And I'm up there with these guys thinking, what the hell am I doing up here with them? And Stephen Grant said, relax, you're fine, which I'll always be grateful to him for that. And Howard said, someone asked, what are you guys doing? And Howard goes, well, basically what we're doing is Bravura Pulp. And I went, that's our name. Because I'm really obsessed with naming things. And I was just obsessed with the idea we didn't have a name yet. And when he said Bravura Pulp, I go, that's what we should call it, Bravura Pulp. And then they ended up shortening it to Bravura. And this is before Pulp Fiction, by the way, just so you know. Pulp Fiction was nowhere, anywhere. Tarantino was a blip. Or he wasn't even, I don't think Reservoir Dogs might have been out. I don't know. But no one knew about any Pulp Fiction. So we called it Bravura. They started making like hats and watches and all this crap. It was really cool to see how machinery started turning and all of a sudden we were really doing things. And we want to do a glow in the dark cover. And Wizard World wants you guys to do a jam cover. And it was exciting, But the most exciting part was just knuckling down and figuring out this story. And Howard helped me a little bit with the outline. He said, I can't read it. I couldn't read it. It's too opaque. It's too much. Got too much stuff happening. And that was a great lesson to learn because I pared it down to the essential elements. And I still try and do that with my work. I still try and pare things down. And I didn't understand anything about story. I didn't understand about like the story arcs or things like that we all take for granted back then. I had to basically teach myself that stuff. And I still work on it to this day. It's still important to me, very important to me. But I had a father-daughter relationship that's in the story that's important to me. And I think is the core, maybe it's the core of the whole thing. A father fighting for his daughter and her right to live the way she wants to live in safety. And that's still kind of what it's about in a lot of ways, although it has become more focused on his daughter and less on him, and her kind of her personal arc, which I enjoy doing. But yeah, that was just an amazing time. And I had planned to do a second one. And what happened was the money just ran out at Malibu, and Marvel came in and bought them. We didn't know at the time, but the reason that Marvel bought them was because they had this computer coloring system that was very, we knew the computer coloring system was groundbreaking, but we didn't know that was the chief reason that Marvel had procured Malibu just before it went into bankruptcy. And so they sent an accountant and a lawyer out from New York to LA to run the company. And the first thing they tried to do was shut down Bravura. They said, you're paying these guys too much money. I had to agree to cut 24 pages of story from the end of my comic and take a rate cut. Otherwise, they would just shut the whole thing down. And so I had to rewrite the ending, and it's not the ending I intended, but it's still okay. And so then I moved on, and I went over and did a small thing at Dark Horse, and then Oni Press. They came out of some of the guys like Bob Schreck and Jamie Rich, who came out of Dark Horse, joined this company with Joe Nosmak, and they created Oni. And so I worked with Oni for a while. And so we bopped around. Now Nocturnals is being published. The omnibuses are being published at Dark Horse, which is great because they did such a beautiful job on a beautiful book. I don't know why it's only $30, but it's only $30 for a book that would normally be like $80, $100, something like that, which is great because that means more people will see it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, because when I first saw Nocturnals, I'm an old school horror fan. I like the old Universal monsters and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And when I saw your work, it just reminded me of the work of Basil Gogos.
Yeah, thank you.
I was just like, I just wanted to keep looking more and more and more at it because there's the shadows and the elements that you put into it. It fit perfectly with the characters. Like you captured their essence with your art so very well. And I think that's part of the lasting legacy of the series.
It's funny because when you look at a lot of horror comics or supernatural or whatever, stuff that's considered gritty or noir, there's not a preponderance of color in a lot of it, or there's a lot of monochromatic or analogous color where all the colors kind of go together in a certain range. And I just didn't come, when it came to doing color for me, because I did go to art school and I had color theory classes and teachers who were painters and stuff. Color was this thing you could just sort of dip your hand into the treasure and pull out all the gold, and it was sparkling, and you just wanted to shower yourself with it. And that's kind of how I feel about color. Is it's like a celebration when you're using color. It's like if you're making a salad, you don't want it just to be green and brown. You don't want it to be brown. You don't want any brown in your salad. You want color. You want colors that that would look good in a plate of food, right? That look appetizing and that pull you in. And to be able to do monsters that aren't Kirby monsters, because they're always colorful, but to do a monster noir type of thing and be able to do color was not like an intentional thing. I always felt like I was using too much color, but because there were those strong darks, it was okay. Mm-hmm. And I still struggle with, does this look like it's the moonlight? What is this lighting I'm doing? I still struggle with that, but at the same time, it doesn't matter because it's a comic book. It's make-believe. It doesn't have to be, okay, yeah, he's lit from over here, and yeah, the moon's behind him over here. There's, it's like, let's not get too caught up in that. But sometimes I catch myself getting that way, but I I don't let it bog me down, because I think it's the feeling that's important. And if the feeling comes out in the colors and the contrast and the you know, and all those kinds of things, then I guess that's good, because I don't know any other way to do it. You know, I have done things that have been kind of monochromatic, but I'm just in love with color. You know, I love black and white. Love seeing artists who do stuff in black and white. But I swear, when I do something, when I ink something, I feel like I need to go further. There needs to be red in here, you know. So I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I didn't grow up on Universal Monsters when I was a kid, just because I couldn't ever find that stuff on TV. There was a lot of other stuff on TV, but I didn't see Creature from the Black Lagoon until I owned a VCR.
Oh, really?
You know? And I love all that stuff. I mean, I put on Bride of Frankenstein every Halloween. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I like the Hammer horror films, but I love the Universal stuff, you know, and I love movies, period. I love all kinds of movies. You know, I have friends that are very, very kind of into the genre stuff, but I like it all. You know, if it's a good story, if it's good acting, there's something that grabs me, I'm there. It's story, you know, story's the thing. But as an artist, I like to draw monsters. I like to draw fantastic creatures and beautiful, you know, women and, you know, femme fatales and all that kind of stuff, you know? And so I gravitate toward that. And that's why Nocturnals is perfect for me, because I wanted to do something that was crime, but it didn't look like a crime book, because there's these creatures in it, but they all act like gangsters, but then hopefully they're not too kind of pastiche, you know, they're not like stereotypical. It's a kind of a, you know, it's you have to really be careful. That you know, you're towing that line. But I still love doing it. I still love those characters. I have a great affinity for them. Actually, I have another graphic. So the last graphic novel came out in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe it's been that long. Maybe 2017. I one of those years. And the follow-up is drawn. It just needs to be painted. And finding the time to do that is tough, you know, when you're doing other projects. But hopefully there'll be a window of opportunity where I can really start working on the painting, and then I'll launch it as a Kickstarter, like I did the last one.
That'd be awesome. Now, one more question I have is, how did you and Rob Zombie get together for album cover, man? Because you're the only person we've spoken to who's got a heavy metal album cover on their resume.
Well, speaking of Basil Gogos, he did such a wonderful, or Basil, album cover for Rob, that there are some times when people say that I did that cover, and I just say, no, Gogos, man. I'm the cover of the CD booklet. So Rob contacts me in the late, I think 96, 97. Rob has been hired because he directed a music video for a song called Boogeyman, which was a Casey and the Sunshine Band cover that was on the soundtrack of the Crow movie.
Part 2.
So because he directed it himself, and he had greatly impressed Edward Pressman, the producer of the Crow, they hired Rob to do a Crow sequel. And it was going to be called The Crow 2037, A New World of Gods and Monsters, taken straight from, you know, Bride of Frankenstein. And which is cool. You know, Rob loves all that stuff. He's a monster kid too. And so they fly me out to LA to do this meeting with Rob. He comes in with all his dreads and tattoos. There were not people with sleeves of tattoos really so much back then. And so that was like, wow, he's got Creature from the Black Lagoon. He's got this, that. He's got the dreads, you know, he's funny, you know, and he's got this crazy idea for a Crow movie that he called his Dark Star Wars. Mm-hmm. If they had made that film, oh my God, if they had made that film. But so they hired me to do concept stuff. So I did 3 big paintings of the main characters, and that was supposed to be stuff that would help sell the investors on the idea of having Christopher Lee play the bad guy. And his girlfriend Sherry play the bad guy's concubine or whatever she was in the story. And so I did these 3 big paintings, and they paid me for them, and that was really cool. And then Rob was telling me about how they had owed him money for the script, and he called them up and said, I'm holding the script over the toilet, and if you don't send me a check today, I'm going to flush it, that kind of stuff. But they did pay him eventually. And then I guess the money that was earmarked to make that went to make the Mutant Chronicles instead with Ron Perlman or whoever's in that. So Ron Perlman's in that. And so that never happened. And Rob turned it around and rewrote it into another screenplay that's never been produced called Demon Hunter Black. And so that was the beginning of me meeting Rob. And I remember Rob had like a Darth Vader backpack from Target, which I had the same backpack. He drove this little shitbox car at the time. This is before, the resurgence.
Right.
He didn't care about his car is what I'm saying. It was just a little get around car, So then less than a year goes by, and he's putting out a solo album, and he asked me to do some artwork for it, which I did. He got Gene Colan to do like a little story inside the CD booklet, which was really cool. And at the time I had been friends with Gene Colan for a while. Got Basil to do the cover of the thing, and it was fun. And the album is very Halloweeny and spooky. It's like his love letter to things he loves. It's not even, I don't even know if it's a half an hour that CD, but you can listen to it over and over again. Mm-hmm. So it was great. It was like this. It was a bromance for me because he wanted to do all these things with me. He wanted to do a Nocturnals meets Rob Zombie crossover. We talked about doing that for a really long time. He went on tour, and I got to go backstage a few times and hang out. He would say, "Finish up that Giant Killer book so we can do our thing." I go, "Okay," And then he was making. By the time I was done, he was like on his way to making movies and stuff. And he even called me up I think it was just after the first Halloween movie that he made came out. He calls me and he says, "I think I want to make a Nocturnals movie." And I said, "Okay." He left this message saying, "Hey, can you call me back or whatever? Who are you involved with? Is it available?" And I was like, "Holy crap." And I knew it wasn't going to happen when it happened, but I was so happy to hear that he wanted to do it that I let myself be happy for like 5 minutes. And then I relaxed, because that's all you can do in movie land is just get happy and then forget about it, because it's never going to happen. And if it does happen to your life, it's just how you have to, like, that's how you survive the hits that you take in the movie business as a creator who's hopeful that your stuff is going to get made. You just assume that it's not going to happen, and there's been lots of bites along the way, but yeah, so it was fun just to get on the phone with Rob. Like after he'd been on, say, Howard Stern, I'd call him and ask him all these questions, and he was always really good about answering questions. But eventually, he gravitates to other things and gets interested in other artists and things like that. He was really interested in Alex Horley's stuff for a while, and David Hartman, I guess, and him are still friendly and doing stuff. And so it was just fun. It was fun to work with him for a while. Yeah. And I've worked with other bands on other album things, and it's always fun to do. It's great to meet new people and get involved with their creative processes and stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting little thing in my career.
Well, that's a hell of a story, I have to say. Before we go, I want to ask, where can people, or if you're on social media, where can they follow you? And what do you have coming up next that we can kind of keep an eye out for?
Well, right now I have an art book that's coming out that we kickstarted called By the Blade, and that's at the printer right now, and that'll be out to backers in the fall. And then budsartbooks.com, they carry pretty much everything that's still in print that I do. So you can find you can go to a local comic shop and you can pre-order stuff that's out there, like the Nocturnals Omnibus. Mm-hmm. Volume 1 is out. Volume 2 comes out in June or July, which I urge you to go and track that down, because it's the second issue, the second book, the second volume is even bigger than the first volume. I mean, they're massive, these things, and they're very cheap but very well done. So those are out there. But like I said, Bud carries so much of my stuff: portfolios, art books, graphic novels, you name it. And because I live about an hour away from Bud's warehouse, we have a good rapport and we're friends, and they've just been very good to me. But I also want to shout out to Flying Colors Comics in Concord, because that was my neighborhood comic shop when I was just getting into doing comics. And Joe Field, who created Free Comic Book Day, that's his shop, and he's been very supportive. And I've been very lucky to have the support of a lot of comic book retailers, who just have kind of always been there for me. But as far as comics right now, yeah, there's Nocturnals, and I think there's some covers I did for what's going to be the latest Mind Management miniseries by Matt Kint. I did some really surreal, crazy, fun variant covers for that series coming out. They just announced that because they have, like, Matt has his own universe at Dark Horse now, so that's kind of fun. And you know, I do covers here and there, but to be honest, because I have a Patreon page and because I do Kickstarter stuff, I'm not reliant on the whims of publishers and editors so much anymore. And so if I'm too busy to do something or it doesn't quite interest me, I can say no, and it doesn't hurt my, it doesn't hurt my career as much, because when you're a freelancer, it feels weird to turn down work. But when you're busy, you got to be honest. I'm too busy, so, but it doesn't, I haven't closed the door on the comic books at all, though. I'm still very much a comic book artist, and I still want to do comics. And like I said, I got the Nocturnals thing I'm still working on, and things like that. But I would say follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram. You can follow me on Facebook too. So then when I launch a new project, you'll get a notification, and you can find everything you're missing on Bud's art books, and just type in my name and you'll see it all.
Hey, and we're back. So, what'd you guys think of our interview with Dan? Really cool guy. Definitely someone I would have hung out with in high school. And I think I probably did hang out with someone like him in high school. I'm talking to him right now. He's the other guy on this podcast. But seriously, yeah, he's really cool. Loved his stories, love his artwork. And he would just, like I said, an absolute pleasure to talk to.
Yeah, his story about Gil Kane and the sketch that he got from him, it was really wonderful. It just shows that his love of comics and, how he respects the legends in the industry. Check out all his stuff. It's so worth it. His art, once you see it, you'll be a fan for life, such like we are. So I'm so glad we were able to chat with him. And if you like us, which we hope you do because you're listening to us right now, look for us on YouTube, on all podcast platforms. We are on Twitter, Dollarman Bandits. We have Dollarman Banter, our fan site on Facebook, and the Dollarman Bandits site also on Facebook. And we are also on Instagram, which Mike handles, so I don't know the handle of that off base, but search it and you'll find it. So thank you so much, guys.